students, and welcome back to another episode of our program Aprender e Estudar em Casa. As always, my name is Edson Horta and I will be your teacher for the English classes of the 9th grade. As always, students, before we start our class, we always correct our homework. But remember that last class you had a homework to do where you would show it to your teacher, okay? So your homework was, imagine that you are at a restaurant and create a role play or dialogue where you, 1, make a reservation, 2, order food, 3, ask for recommendation, 4, say what you will eat, and 5, ask for the check. Students, this was your homework of the previous class. You had to create a dialogue and a role play where you had to do all this, all the 5 steps, okay? I hope you did it and you showed it to your teacher for correction, okay? So without further ado, let's start today's lesson. And in today's topic, we are going to talk about the passive and the active voice. So in today's lesson, you will learn about the passive and the active voice, and you will also learn to describe a process using both the passive and active voices. As always, our sources for this class are down below in perfectenglishgrammar.com and ego4u.com. You can always check these 2 links for clarification of doubts and questions. Yes, students, today we will talk about the passive and active voice, all right? But what will be our theme for today, okay? Our theme for today will be inventions. This is what we will use to talk about the passive and active voice. And here you have some of the greatest inventions of mankind's history. You have the telephone, the car, and the locomotive. Now, as you can see from these pictures, the telephone, the car, and the locomotive are very different from what we have today because they were invented a long time ago. So yes, students, we will be using the inventions of mankind to talk about the passive and the active voice, okay? So now that we have seen our introduction and what we will talk about, let's start our lesson, okay? Let's go. So the question is, what are the passive and active voices? Well, the active voice means that a sentence has a subject that performs or does the action. For example, Philo Farnsworth invented the television in 1934. And can you see that picture, students? Yes, that was the first television invented in 1934. Very different from what we have today. In the active voice, you have a subject in a sentence, and this subject does the action told or said by the verb. Okay, so it's the subject that performs the action. That's an active sentence. So you have someone that does something. Okay, now that's the active. Now let's see about the passive. Now what about the passive voice? Well, the passive voice means that a subject is acted on or suffers the action by the verb. For example, the television was invented by Philo Farnsworth in 1934. Well, students, that's the main difference between the active and the passive. In the active voice, you have the subject, and he's the one that does the action, all right? But in the passive voice, now, the subject is the one that suffers the action by the verb. In this case, in the first sentence, the subject was Philo Farnsworth, and he invented the television. Now, in the passive voice, you have that the television was invented by Philo Farnsworth, who was the subject, okay? But if you didn't understand, we still have some more practical examples, and I'm sure you will understand it by the end of the lesson, okay? Let's continue. The passive versus the active. Now, in the passive voice, it focuses on the action and not the person doing it. For example, the radio was invented in 1895. Now, here is a clear example on what the passive focus on. It focuses on the action. In this case, the radio was invented, but we don't know who invented it, okay? Let's take a look at the active now. Now, the active is more direct, focusing on who did what. And the example is, Guglielmo Marconi invented the radio in 1895. Now, students, here you have the difference that I told you about, right? Now, the active is more direct, and the sentence tells us who invented what. In this case, Guglielmo Marconi was the one that invented the radio. All right? Let's continue. Now we're going to talk about the structure of the active voice. Let's take a look at this sentence. Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876. Now, the Graham Bell is the subject. Invented the telephone, we have invented as the verb. And in 1876 is the object. So this is the basic structure of the active voice. Yes, students, the basic structure of the active voice is the subject, in this case, Graham Bell. You have the verb, invented, and then you have the object in 1876. Now, the subject here is Graham Bell. Invented is the verb, all right? Now, let's take a look at how this changes when we transform this sentence into the passive. Let's take a look at the structure. Now, you have the same sentence, but with a different structure. Of course, we're talking about the passive. Now, in this sentence, you have the telephone as the object, was invented. You still have the verbs to be in the past, was, and invented in the past participle. And now, 1876 becomes the complement. Now, students, what you can see from the structure here is that we switched. Now, what did we switch? The object in the active sentence becomes the subject in the passive sentence, all right? And be careful, we do not always have a subject that stays or goes to the end of the sentence. Like in this case, the date 1876 is just a complement. It's just to close the idea, all right? To close the sentence, okay? So this is the basic structure and what happens when we move or we change from the active into the passive, okay? Let's see some practical examples. Now, here you have the practical examples with different sentences and different verbs. In the first tense, we have the present simple. Let's take a look at the sentences in the active. Sentence number 1, I make a cake. Now, to change it into the passive, we have to do the switch. Now, in the passive, the sentence becomes, a cake is made. You can add by me, but if you don't add it, it's not a problem. It doesn't make any difference, okay? Now, students, let's take a look here. In the first sentence, which is in the present simple, I make a cake. You have the subject, I, you have the verb make, and then you have the object, cake. But what happens when we change into the passive? Now, the object, which is the cake, takes the place of the subject, okay? We still have the verb, and you can decide if we have a complement at the end of the sentence or not, because in the passive, we focus on what? On the action, and not on who did the action, okay? Let's continue. Now, in the second sentence of the active in the present simple, we have Rita writes a letter. Now, what happens when we change it into the passive? The sentence becomes, a letter is written by Rita. Now, students, what happens here is what we talked about in the first example and in the previous slides. You have a switch. In the active voice, you have the subject Rita, you have the verb writes, and then you have the object, a letter. But what happens when we change from the active into the passive is that the object takes place of the subject, and the subject goes to the end of the sentence. Like in this case, a letter is written by Rita. A letter now is the subject and the verb, and then in the end you have the object, Rita. So that's it. You just change places. You just switch. All right? Now that we have talked about the passive and the active in the present simple, let's take a look at the active and the passive in another verb tense. In this case, the past simple. All right? Let's see some practical examples. Now, with the past simple, you have the following sentences. In the active, sentence number 1, I made a cake. Now, look that made is the verb make from the present simple in the first sentence, but now in the past. So, I made a cake. Now, this is the active. Now, when we go to the passive, the sentence changes. Of course, we have to make the switch. Now, the sentence is, a cake was made by me. Now, students, what happened here? The same thing, same process. The subject, the verb, and the object in the active, they switch when we go to the passive, all right? The object becomes the subject, and the subject becomes the object. And remember that when we are talking about the passive, you might choose to add or not who made the action, because in the passive, we just focus on what happened, not on who did what, okay? Let's see the second example. In the second example, you have Rita wrote a letter. Now, this, again, is the same sentence as in the present simple, but now the verb is in the past simple. So, Rita wrote a letter. This is the active. Rita is the subject, wrote is the verb, and a letter is the object. Now, when we go to the passive, what happens is the same thing. We change. The object, a letter, comes to the beginning, was written, becomes, is still the verb, and by Rita is now the object. So we switched the places of the object and the subject. All right, students, so that was the main changes that we do when we talk about the passive and the active. But there is one important thing that you need to be careful of, all right? And this is the note that we have here. So, you must study the past participle of the verbs to know how to change the active into the passive. But why is this, students? Because when we are talking about the changes in the present simple or in the past simple, you have to change the verb according with the tense of the sentence. If it is in the present, the verb stays in the present. But when we talk about the past, you see there, was made and was written. Okay. You have the verb to be in the past, was, but then you have the second verb in the past participle. So you must study the past participle in order to know how to change the verbs. And don't forget, the past participle is the third column on the list of verbs. You have the infinitive, the past simple, and then the past participle. So that's what you have to study. Okay? Very good, students. I hope you understood this lesson. It's very easy. You just have to switch when we are talking about the active to the passive. But we cannot end our lesson without some practice, okay? Now, let's do the exercises. We are back, students, and now it's time for our practice, all right? Now, we are talking about the passive and the active voice. And for today's exercise, what do you have to do? Let's take a look. Now, for practice, you have the question, are the sentences in the passive or active? This is what you have to identify, students. You have 5 sentences that I'm going to read, and you have to say if they belong to the active voice or the passive voice, all right? Now, let me read the sentences, and then you will identify if they belong to the passive or the active. So sentence number 1, Stephen likes to play basketball. Stephen likes to play basketball. Sentence number 2, bingo is played in Britain. Bingo is played in Britain. Sentence number 3, he lost his keys yesterday. He lost his keys yesterday. Sentence number 4, a letter was written. A letter was written. Sentence number 5, they are listening to music. They are listening to music. Very well, students, those were the 5 sentences, all right? And you must identify which ones belong to the active and which ones belong to the passive, okay? But as always, I know you're very good students and you will do very well. So take your time. Well, students, now that you had some time to identify which sentences belong to the passive and which ones belong to the active voice, let's correct your exercise, all right? Let's take a look. So in sentence number 1, Stephen likes to play basketball. Is it a passive or an active? Very good, it is an active sentence. Sentence number 2, bingo is played in Britain. Is it active or passive? Yes, it is a passive sentence. Number 3, he lost his keys yesterday. Very good. Once again, it is an active sentence. Number 4, a letter was written. And sentence number 4 is a passive sentence. And the last sentence, number 5, they are listening to music, is an active sentence. Very good. All right, students, those were the exercises that you had to do in identifying which ones were active sentences or passive sentences, all right? But we are not done yet. As always, after our exercises, it's time for homework. Well, students, let's see what is your homework for today, all right? Let's take a look. Now, as your homework for today, you have to change the sentences from the active to the passive. So you have 5 sentences that you have to change from the active to the passive. Sentence number 1, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Number 2, the people elected the president. The people elected the president. Number 3, Mom read the book in one day. Mom read the book in one day. Number 4, Larry and Sergey founded Google. Larry and Sergey founded Google. And the last sentence, number 5, Marie sold coffee. Marie sold coffee. Well, students, those were the 5 sentences that you have to change from the active voice into the passive voice. Remember that when you have to change a sentence from the active to the passive, what do you need to do? The switch, and you need to use the verb accordingly to the verb tense, all right? But there's something that you can also use to help you do this homework better. And what is this? It's the list of regular and irregular verbs. So here you have 2 different lists. In the first list, you have irregular verbs, just irregular verbs, with the base form or the infinitive, like we say. The second column is the verbs in the simple past, and in the third column, you have the verbs in the past participle. Now remember, these are just irregular verbs. Now in the second picture, you have regular verbs. You just have regular verbs, and you have the same 3 columns. The verbs in the present or infinitive, in the past, which is the second column, and in the past participle. Now, students, remember that you need to know how the verbs are going to be or conjugated in the past participle if you want to change the verbs from the active into the passive. So the list of verbs can help you do that. And it's very easy. Research on Google, list of regular or list of irregular verbs. You will find those lists, and they will be able to help you do your homework. Another option is for you to go to your school library and use the grammar, English grammar, where they have regular or irregular verbs, or ask your teacher if they can lend you theirs, all right? And that's it, students. That is your homework, and don't forget, use the list of regular and irregular verbs to help you change the sentences from the active into the passive, okay? Now that we have discussed our topic, we have done the exercises and your homework, it's time for revision. Well, students, now that we have discussed today's topic, the passive and the active voice, we've seen their structure, the exercises, and you had your homework to do, it's time for our review, okay? So in today's lesson, we learned that the active voice tells us what a person or thing does. That means that the subject on an active sentence is the one that performs the action, does the action on the object. We also saw that the basic structure of an active voice sentence is the subject plus the verb plus the object. On the other hand, we have that the passive voice tells us what is done to someone or something. That also means that the subject is the one that suffers the action, and that the basic structure of a passive sentence is the object plus the verb plus the subject. All right, students, that was the review. And remember, the basic structure is the key for you to know how to change the sentence from active to the passive. All right? You just have to switch. Okay? But let's see this with some examples. Now, here you have some sentences to show you how these sentences change from the active voice to the passive voice. Now, let's take a look at the active voice first. You have Sally, which is the subject. You have drove, which is the action or the verb. And you have her car, which is the object of the road. Now, when we change this active sentence to the passive, what happens is that the object changes with the subject, changes place with the subject. Let's see what happened. Now, the car is the object, was driven is the action of the verb, and we changed the verb. Now, we have the verb to be in the past, was, and we have driven, which is the past participle, remember that, off the road by Sally. Now, Sally is the subject, and now she is at the end of the sentence in the passive voice. Okay. All right, students, were you able to get that? In the active sentence, we have the subject, the verb or action, and the object, and in the passive, we have the switch, the object, the verb, and the subject. All right? But if you didn't get that, we have another sentence as an example. Now, in the second sentence, we have the dog as the subject, beat as the action or verb, and Timmy as the object. And then you have the rest of the sentence, on the arm. Now, when we change this sentence from the active voice into the passive voice, what happens is that Timmy, which was the object, comes to the front, changes places. Was beaten is the action of or the verb, and we change the verb. We add the verb to be plus the past participle, and then on the arm, and last we have the subject, all right, which was in the beginning of the active sentence. So once again, students, you have what happens when we change a sentence from the active into the passive, all right? There is a switch, okay? Very well. So that was our review for today's lesson. All right, students, that was another episode of our program Aprender e Estudar em Casa. As always, my name is Edson Horta, and I am your English teacher for the 9th grade. Remember, students, that we are dealing with a pandemic situation. COVID-19 is still out there, so it's very important for you to follow the 3 simple rules. Wear your masks, practice social distancing, and always wash your hands. Okay? So, as always, practice your English and stay safe.